let's welcome Liz McAllister to Conversations on Couches. Liz, thanks for joining me today. And we're exploring with a couple different people this topic of beauty. And, in our crazy world right now is as needed as ever, I think, to have some of these conversations. So thanks for joining us on a couch. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the couch that you are sitting on there?
Sure. This couch is actually my housemate's couch, but it has a cool feature where you can, these back pillow things, you just push them straight back and it like extends. And so lots of people have slept on this couch. They tell me it's very comfortable, but I wouldn't know.
That sounds like a great couch. All right. Well, thanks again for joining me today. So let's just start off with this real simple question. When you hear the word beauty, what comes to mind? How would you define either the term or the concept for someone if they were to ask you, Liz, what does beauty mean to you?
Let's see. Well, I'm a bit of an art addict, you could say. I took a few classes in high school. And I started realizing that I would choose an art class over like another class, because you can only choose so many classes. And then in college, I was not an art major, but snuck in a few more art classes. And one of my teachers finally told me, Liz, just study art. And I was like, I don't know, I'm not very good at it. I just enjoy it. I like studying it. And she was like, okay, you should look at design, like consider design, because it kind of puts like you have a bit of an engineering mind and you can put those two things together. So that's how I ended up at Davis, actually, studying design in the design department. And I thought a lot, and we've had a lot of art history classes that wrestle with beauty as like a philosophical idea, but then also beauty as like a functional thing that's measurable. And so I think being party to all of those discussions, I think there are a couple characteristics that I would say make something beautiful. So to me, something that is beautiful is enduring. It stands the test of time. And maybe sometimes it may not look as beautiful as whatever else is in its surroundings, but it can stand on its own and be beautiful. I think things that are beautiful are complex, but not complicated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
it. And then I think those are the two, I would also say the last thing is, I think things that are beautiful are truthful or honest, you could say. They're not deceptive. But I don't know if that's those characteristics that I've identified are too vague, but I think it was a good starting point in terms of me boiling it down. Like, what is something that is beautiful?
Yeah, that's really interesting things to think about there, and leads really into the next question, which is about how you sort of see beauty in your creative work, which for the sake of this conversation is design. And just so people know, like, you've done some design work for Discovery. You did the Matthew series. You did the Our Kind of Crazy series artwork for that. And I just love the stuff that you make. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how, as you are working on something, crafting something, how does design connect? How do you sort of make something that is complex but not complicated? I love that phrase. Tell us a little bit more about how all that works.
Okay. Well, some designers may tell you that like their best work is when they're successful or when they create something that meets their own standards. But I think I fall a little bit more on if the person who has asked me to make something is happy with what I've made, then I would call it successful. Or maybe if we're both happy with what has come out of that, then it's a successful design. That's one way to think about it. And so I think a lot of things that I have worked on for Discovery or just anywhere they've been these collaborative things where we're going back and forth, like here are a few ideas, which one is your favorite, let's work on that thing together. And so there's this iterative process that takes place where you're constantly refining an idea and asking, like, does that idea embody everything that we started out with, when the idea was being formed? And so I think in that way, there are a lot of really fun ways to make things complex. For example, in our Kind of Crazy series, Roly and I, we snuck in the word coffee. There's this whole mosaic of words. We snuck the word coffee in there. Or the Matthew series was, if you flip through all the first, the main sermon, title pages almost, if you put them all next to each other and flipped through them rapidly, you can watch a building take shape and becoming more three-dimensional. It's the building that we would typically be meeting in. And nobody is really going to pay attention to that, right? But maybe if you're like me and you kind of think about these things and you wonder, how can you bring an idea to life through design? So anyway, I would say little things like that, little thought processes that you don't even tip your hand until later on, or you maybe tell someone afterwards, by the way, we snuck in a few words here and there.
Yeah.
But I think you can make things interesting and complex, but not complicated.
Yeah, and there's to me, there's an element of storytelling in that too. It's not just an image that communicates a particular thought, but it does sort of invite you into this, hey, what is going on here? And hey, a couple of weeks ago it looked like this, but now it looks like this. And again, not everyone is going to sit down and necessarily try to figure the puzzle out, but I think there's more of participation, invitation to what is the story that's being told here through some of that. So I think that's very cool. Again, kind of connecting back to some of those ideas of beauty that you were laying out earlier. Let's talk about it not so much from designing for a purpose or for people, but talk to us a little bit about the joy of the creative process and in that process of making something. When do you have that feeling of ooh, this is pretty good, or I like this, or this is hitting me somewhere, or I'm kind of feeling this thing? What is that moment like, and how do you know that moment when you're making something?
Interesting. I think other people might back me up on this one, but that's a different feeling for the thing that you're making, or the design process you're undertaking. If I am in a ceramic studio and I'm throwing a mug, that moment of joy I think might come at a different time or in a different way than if I am at a computer designing something graphically. I think my most favorite design moments have actually been doing a little bit bigger picture design. So I love theory and philosophy, and just basically putting things in my brain that I don't understand and then wrestling with them and trying to make some sense out of them. And doing that visually, or doing that within the design process, to me makes a lot of sense. And it helps me to understand some of those complex things. And so there's this area of theoretical physics that in undergrad, for my honors thesis, I tried to blend into design. I did present this at a conference. I might be one of the only people in the world who knows or cares about this concept, but it's okay. But basically it's about the design of systems. And systems, that could be an organizational management structure within a company. It could be something else entirely. But the things that I care a lot about human rights. That's also something that I studied in school. And so thinking about how you can make empathetic and useful systems and structures that can give dignity to people who may be, if you're a refugee perhaps, or experiencing homelessness, you may not have a home to call your own. And that is an unfortunate fact, and that is an unfortunate process to be a part of. However, there are ways that you can design dignity into that process or lend a hand. And so taking a careful and critical eye to some of those systems and policies that are already in place and that may govern that experience for those people, and then remaking them. It doesn't mean you have to always start from scratch. But to bring this back to your question, I think moments where I get to pull in policy and science and lived experience, like talking to people one-on-one, and then you can work together to like co-design a better process and a better system for them, just to be able to live a more humane life, I think is that getting to that point and working on those projects are really exciting to me.
That's awesome. So part of what I'm hearing there is there's that like this deeply human element to it as well. So it's not just like cool lines or colors or fonts or whatever, but like how does this impact people? And again, design not just in terms of like a slide that we use on Sunday morning, but in terms of how we structure ourselves as people, which I'm gonna lead you here probably more than we had talked about before, but that's okay. What you were just talking about to me sounds a lot like this idea of shalom that the biblical writers talk about, right? Which is a system, like the system that God designed and sort of set up for human flourishing the way that he wanted his creation to function. And so that there are things that we can do even in our broken world to design the world in such a way that does sort of lead towards that or point people towards that. And so the last question was just how do you see, or how does design and particularly beauty, how does that help you understand more about God, about who God is? How does that help you see God at work in the world? Kind of a couple different questions there, but you can answer that however you want.
Okay, gosh. There's this verse in Ecclesiastes. It says, he, meaning God, has made everything beautiful in its time. And then he has put eternity into the heart of man. And to me, to design mankind with the ability to approach the topic of eternity, or he has designed us like with a missing part to then fill in, however you want to look at that. That is an intentional design choice, if you will, would stand up well in a design critique. But just to think about the character of a God who would do such a thing, who would choose not just to make humanity in his exact image perfectly with like no room for error, but who made us with free will, who made us to be made beautiful in our own times and in different ways. That is like that like could bring me to tears if I stopped and like really meditated on that and considered that. I think growing up too, I mean, I said I liked philosophy, and I think some of the reasons for that was because I read this kind of like classic called The Book of Virtues. And there's all these little stories from just throughout time and space and imagination of characters, of people who struggle, and all of them are being made beautiful. They're learning these moral and ethical lessons. They're usually by the end of the story, if it's a successful outing, they have learned a virtue or they have gained virtue. And Aristotle actually talks about beauty, like true beauty, as not being like able to be separated from virtue. So something that is beautiful is also virtuous, which, I mean, we could get into this in an art history discussion, but some people only think of things as beautiful as like aesthetically beautiful, or like those lines and the colors that you talked about earlier. But I think I am more on the beautiful things are not just beautiful skin deep. Like it's really the things you can't see about them, the things that God puts in the heart, if you will, Mm-hmm. I think those things that makes things beautiful too. But just to consider a God who even made the human mind like capable of thinking about that, of connecting with his character, of beginning to explore and understand and be awed and humbled by the character of our God. That is a beautiful God to me. I don't know if that like takes a good crack at your question, but it's a good question.
No, it totally does. It totally does. And I think it gives like, I'm going to be thinking about this conversation for a while because there's a lot of really interesting stuff. And I do kind of nerd out about some of the like, some of that theory and philosophy stuff, but really great, Liz, for you to join us, for you to share some of these thoughts. People in our community know how to find you, so you may get some follow-up questions, which is great. But thanks for joining us for Conversations on Couches about beauty.
Yeah, thank you for having me. You have a pretty great couch yourself too. I don't know if you told the story behind it.
No, I don't. Well, I think somebody like gave them to the church, and a lot of people have sat on them, and that's probably about as much as I want to say about that.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Yes. Thanks, Liz.